founder of Rock City Gardens, Frita Ujamalin Carter, loved fairy tales and folklore. As she set about creating the garden, she placed gnomes and figurines along the enchanted trail to delight visitors. In the 1940s, Fairyland Caverns and Mother Goose Village were added to showcase even more fairy tales with glowing blacklight dioramas. Over the years, Rock City has intrigued and inspired writers like Cormac McCarthy and Neil Gaiman. We hope you're able to visit soon and see these marvels for yourself and find a little inspiration of your own. Learn more at searockcity.com.
Good morning. My name is Langston Collin Wilkins, and I'm a folklorist who works for Humanities Washington in Seattle. But on behalf of Humanities Tennessee, I want to welcome you to the 32nd Annual Southern Festival of Books. And I'm honored to be talking to Natasha Trethewey on her incredible new book, Memorial Drive, A Daughter's Memoir, during this session. But before we dive into the formal program, I have a couple of housekeeping notes. One, if you're watching this on Facebook Live or YouTube, and you want to ask questions during the session, you'll need to either download the festival app or visit the streaming site www.humtn.org/SFB. I want to thank our wonderful sponsors, Metro Nashville Arts Commission, Ingram Content Group, the Tennessee Arts Commission, Vanderbilt University, and Parnassus Books. And Parnassus also happens to be our bookseller, and your purchases of the book via Parnassus helps to keep the festival free. And there will be links to purchase books in the chat, so please do that. And again, the festival is a free nonprofit event that is supported by donations from individuals. So if you appreciate the festival and you want to support it, you can do so by visiting www.humtn.org. And finally, the festival inclusion policy applies online as in person. So anyone making inappropriate comments in the chat will be removed. So please do not do that. Now, Natasha Trethewey served 2 terms as the 19th Poet Laureate of the United States from 2012 to 2014. She is the author of 5 collections of poetry, as well as a book of creative nonfiction. In 2007, she won the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry for her collection, Native Guard. And her 2018 collection, Monument, was longlisted for the 2018 National Book Award. And she is currently the Board of Trustees Professor of English at Northwestern University. And again, we're here to talk about her incredible new memoir, Memorial Drive, A Daughter's Memoir, which is a chillingly personal and exquisitely wrought memoir of her reckoning with the brutal murder of her mother at the hands of her former stepfather in 1985. And it's also an intimate story of her coming of age as a biracial youth in both the Jim Crow South and what some call the New South in Atlanta. And naturally, of course, it's a complex rumination on race. So to begin the program, I want to welcome Natasha, and I'll invite you to read a selection from Memorial Drive.
Love to, thank you. This is from the very beginning of the book. 3 weeks after my mother is dead, I dream of her. We walk a rutted path, an oval track around which we are making our slow revolution. Side by side, so close our shoulders nearly touch, neither of us speaking, both of us in our traces. Though I know she is dead, I have a sense of contentment, as if she's only gone someplace else to which I've journeyed to meet her. The world around us is dim, a backdrop of shadows out of which now a man comes. Even in the dream, I know what he has done, and yet I smile, lifting my hand and speaking a greeting as he passes. It's then that my mother turns to me, then that I see it, a whole the size of a quarter in the center of her forehead. From it comes a light so bright, so piercing, that I suffer the kind of momentary blindness brought on by staring at the sun, her face nothing but light ringed in darkness when she speaks. Do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? I know I am not meant to answer, and so we walk on as before, rounding the path until we meet him again. This time, he's come to finish what he started. Holding a gun, he is aiming at her head. This time, I think I can save her. Is it enough to throw myself in the bullet's path, shout no? I wake to that single word, my own voice wrenching me from sleep. But it's my mother's voice that remains, her last question to me. Do you know what it means to have a wound that never heals? A refrain. Nearly 30 years after my mother's death, I went back for the first time to the place she was murdered. I'd not been there since the year I turned 19, when I had to clean out her apartment, disposing of everything I could not or would not carry with me, all the furniture and household items, her clothing, her large collection of records. I kept only a few of her books, a heavy belt made of bullets, and a single plant she had loved, a Dieffenbachia. Throughout my childhood, it had been my responsibility to tend it, every week dusting and misting the upper leaves and snipping the browned lower ones. Be careful when you handle it, my mother warned. A small precaution, seemingly unnecessary, but there is a toxin in the sap of the Dieffenbachia. It oozes from the leaves and the stems where they are cut. Dumb cane, the plant is called, because it can cause a temporary inability to speak. Struck dumb, we say, when fear or shock or astonishment renders us mute. Dumb grief, when the grief is not expressed in uttered words. I could not then grasp the inherent metaphor of the plant, my relationship with my mother, what it would mean that she had made its care my duty, while warning me of its danger. When I left Atlanta, vowing never to return, I took with me what I had cultivated all those years, mute avoidance of my past, silence and willed amnesia buried deep in me like a root. Nor could I have anticipated then that anything would ever draw me back to that city, to a geography that held at every turn a reminder of a past I was determined to forget, even as I tried to honor her memory in every way I knew how. Indeed, going back for work after accepting a university faculty position, I thought I could circumvent my former life, going out of my way to avoid at least the one place I could not bear to see, until I had to. To get there, I had to drive past landmarks that took me back to 1985, the county courthouse where the trials were held, the train station from which my mother traveled downtown to work, the DeKalb County Police Station at the intersection of Highway 285, the bypass loop around Metro Atlanta, and make my way down Memorial Drive, a major east-west artery once named Fair Street. It originates in the middle of the city, Memorial, and winds east from downtown, ending at Stone Mountain, the nation's largest monument to the Confederacy. A lasting metaphor for the white mind of the South, Stone Mountain rises out of the ground like the head of a submerged giant, the nostalgic dream of Southern heroism, gallantry emblazoned on its brow. In bas-relief, the enormous figures of Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Jefferson Davis. Not far from its base is the apartment we lived in that last year at the 5400 block of Memorial, number 18D. Though I knew exactly where it was, knew the landmarks leading up to it, I drove right past it first and had to double back to enter the tree-lined front gate. From there, I could see Stone Mountain in the distance, suddenly visible where Memorial crests, as if to remind me what is remembered here and what is not. The last time I was at the apartment, the morning after her death, I could see the faded chalk outline of her body on the pavement, the yellow police tape still stuck to the door, the small round hole in the wall beside her bed where a single bullet, a missed shot, had lodged. Nothing in the landscape today bears evidence to any of that, though everything seems to carry with it the imprint of loss. Row after row of rusted stair rails and window screens mark the shabby buildings, just a decade old when we moved in, and a lighter shade of paint coats the walls as if to hide the dark history beneath it. I keep an image of myself from that first day after her death at the apartment. There's a video recording of my arrival made by a local news station, and so the image is not only of those few moments, but of watching myself from a distance, entering my former life for what I thought to be the last time. In the footage, I walk up the stairs to the door and step in, shutting it behind me. When I think of it now, I don't hear any words, the volume on mute. Perhaps the reporter spoke our names, or perhaps she did not, calling my mother victim instead. And in my mind's eye, a caption fills the bottom of the screen. It identifies me as daughter of the murdered woman. Even then, I felt as though I were watching someone else, a young woman on the cusp of her life, adulthood and bereavement gripping her at once. The young woman I'd become, walking out of that apartment hours later, was not the same one who went into it. It's as if she's still there, that girl I was, behind the closed door, locked in the footage where it ends. Often, I've seen that doorway in my dreams. Only now is it a threshold I can cross.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I think I'm wondering, as a jumping off point, you've had an incredibly prolific career as a poet. So I'm wondering, why is this particular book, this memoir, coming out right now at this point in your life and career? So can you kind of take us through the genesis of this book?
Sure. Well, over the years, with the increasing recognition that I was getting as a poet, I was being written about more and more in newspapers and magazines. And when I was written about, my backstory became part of the story. And in my backstory, my mother was often mentioned only as a kind of footnote, as this victim, or reduced to simply the murdered woman. And it really hurt me that she was being erased or diminished, and her role as the person who most influenced me becoming a poet, the reason that I am a poet is because of that great loss, losing her when I was 19. And so I decided that if she were going to be mentioned in my backstory, I was going to be the one that needed to tell a fuller version of her story and to place her in her proper perspective as the person who made me the writer that I am.
No, thank you. And keeping with that, the book, you were able to really shed light on how remarkable of a woman your mother was. So I'm wondering, as you were writing her story and working on this book, what did you learn or come to better understand about your mother by writing her story?
Well, that's hard. I mean, I think, so much of it is me trying to reconstruct what I could of what little memory I had left, because I spent so many years trying to forget those very difficult, painful years. But I was very fortunate to have a lot of her own words turn to, because I was given, which I mentioned in the book, I was given in 2001 all of the police records, the whole file. And one of the amazing things that I found in the file was about a 13-page document, a narrative that my mother was writing about her own journey of getting away from this abusive ex-husband. And I also got the transcripts of phone conversations that she had to tape 2 days leading up to her death when she was trying to get an arrest warrant from the police, from the courts. And in those things, I see really evidence of what I already knew. My mother was extremely brave and resilient and smart. And you see it come out in her own voice in those recordings and in her own writing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And, you know, in a similar way, I'm wondering, on page 85, you write, quote, "If trauma fragments the self, then what does it mean to have dominion over the self?"
Yes.
So I'm wondering, you know, how has writing this book affected your understanding of yourself and of who you are?
Well, you know, it took me a long time to write the book because the story is the hard thing to figure out. You know, Vivian Gornick has this wonderful book called The Situation and the Story. And in it, you know, she helps you to understand that there is the situation I was in. And the situation was having grown up in this household of domestic violence and losing my mother, and having to make my way in the world, carrying grief for these last 35 years. That was a situation, but what was the story? The hardest thing was figuring out the story. And the way we make story out of our lives, of course, is the backwards look, where we begin to see all of the figurative possibilities of moments in our lives that we might not have been conscious of the metaphor or the potential meaning or the arc that they were part of. But that's what you can see going back. And so, you know, I learned something about my own ability to make story, to make sense of the life I was leading, and how the necessity of doing that, and how what I do recall and how I do fit it together is part of my own resilience. And it's part of my own ability to make meaning out of losing my mother and rendering it meaningful in my own path toward becoming a writer, as opposed to merely senseless.
No, thank you. Thank you. You know, place plays a central role in this memoir. So, you know, we start in Jim Crow, Mississippi, at your family's homestead. You know, we dip into New Orleans. We then move to this burgeoning Black Mecca of Atlanta in the 1970s and early 1980s. And of course, Memorial Drive, right? And in the literal and metaphorical sense, right? So for many people, place is merely a setting or a backdrop for their lives, or at least they see it that way. But place seems to play a very important role in your memoir. So I'm wondering, can you talk about why you chose to position place so prominently in this memoir, and how has these shifting landscapes, you know, affected your life?
Well, I think about Ralph Ellison's revision of Heraclitus's axiom, character is fate. to geography is fate. Those places carry with them history. And being from those places means that one also carries the history that goes along with those places and affects one's place in the world. It's impossible, I think, to understand who I became as a writer without thinking about the connections to place. I think of also E.O. Wilson's words that Homo sapiens is the only species to suffer psychological exile. The idea that for me, growing up Black and biracial in the Deep South, in my native Mississippi, and then Georgia, to which I was a transplant, I grew up with that sense of psychological exile because monuments to the Confederacy, to white supremacy and the lost cause, to an attempt to maintain slavery and the second-class citizenry of African Americans were everywhere around me. And indeed, that particular history is what I think of as my first existential wound, and it is connected to place. W.H. Auden, in his memorial to William Butler Yeats, wrote, "Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry." Well, likewise, my native land, my South and my Mississippi, with its brutal history of racial violence and oppression, inflicted my first wound, hurting me into poetry. And that's all about place and also the history embedded, inscribed on the landscape of that place.
Wow, thank you. That really resonates, And, I'm wondering, keeping with this, how can you compare the dynamics of being a biracial youth in Jim Crow Mississippi to your experience as a biracial youth in the New South or Atlanta? How can you compare those two? Are they similar, different? I'm just curious.
And I'm sort of chuckling because I wonder at what point we would say, my husband's a historian, I'd like to go ask him this, that the Jim Crow South ended. I mean,
Right.
You're kind of making me feel old. I was born in 1966, but let's not forget the 64 and 65, Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. So one might argue that supposedly the Jim Crow South ended then, but I just grew up in another version of the South. But I also grew up. You asked what it means to grow up, biracial. It would be hard for me to separate what it means to grow up biracial from what it means to grow up Black in the South. I mean, that's what I grew up as. We live in a country that still believes in the idea of the one drop rule. So growing up, I was Black, but I was also biracial. The biracial part meant white people looked at me all the time and said, "What are you?" The biracial part meant white people said, "Well, you're not like the rest of them." To which I'd have to say, and who is the rest of them? My mother? My grandmother? Biracial meant sometimes being in the room when white people didn't know anyone Black was in the room and hearing what they say when they don't know that.
That makes sense. So, you paint shifting a bit, you paint a very detailed and complex portrait of your your former stepfather, your mother's killer. And so can you talk about how you approached writing about him? Because I imagine that had to be a very complicated part of an already very complicated writing process.
Well, mostly I write about him in the way that I remember him. But of course, his voice is in the book as well, because he's on those transcripts. So I also allow a reader to see him as he was presenting himself in those official documents. But to write about someone who has done a terrible thing, I think still requires the measure of empathy that allows to see even the worst people as fully human, which meant for me, regardless of what he did, I reminded myself, because I believe in a kind of restorative justice, that he was a child once. He was an innocent once, before whatever happened to disfigure his soul so much that he could commit an act like that. That's empathy.
And I'm wondering, in your assessment, did your, obviously you were a Black child, but also a biracial child. And I'm wondering, did, your biracial nature, in your opinion, do you think it affected your stepfather's treatment of you?
I think it contributed to his feelings of resentment. I think he resented the fact that I represented my mother's former marriage, and that my mother's former marriage was to a white man, and I was the living, embodiment of that. So whatever injustice he felt in the world based on racism probably was somehow embodied in who I was. I can imagine that would cause a kind of resentment.
And, you mentioned, I guess, the transcripts of the phone call between your mother and your former stepfather. And, you included those transcripts directly in the text. You also included a police statement that your mother gave to the police. So I'm wondering, why you chose to include these elements or this source material in such a direct way.
Well, I think it goes back to something I was saying earlier. In writing this memoir, I could have spent even more time, showing you who she was through my own lens as daughter. And I could tell you how brilliant and resilient and strong and patient she was, or I could let you see it in her own words. And that is the best evidence of it. I mean, I think there's two kinds of evidence. I am evidence of it, which is why I use Shakespeare's, the quote from Shakespeare's sonnet number 3, "Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime." I am the mirror of my mother. So if there's any part of you that thinks that I'm extraordinary because somehow I've made it through all this, well, I'm my mother's mirror. But I'm also showing you her own evidence. Incontrovertible, I think.
Absolutely. Totally. Absolutely. And, I'll admit that reading this book was hard for me. I recently lost a parent suddenly, not necessarily tragically, but suddenly. And, I'm learning that grief is a process and it's a journey. And I was also reading your poem, Imperatives for Carrying On in the Aftermath. And you close by saying that, you carry your mother's body or her corpse on your back. And you also mentioned, even in your memoir, that this is a wound that never heals. So I'm wondering how writing this book and directly engaging with this story, how has it affected your grieving process, or how did it intersect with it? Did it help with healing, or did it make wounds deeper? Because I can't imagine, writing a book like this. So I'm just wondering how it affected you.
Well, as you say, grief, bereavement like this is a journey, and it is something that I think you carry for a lifetime, and it ebbs and flows. I mean, having to go deep into trying to remember this difficult past and reading those documents brought everything to the surface so that the grief feels really fresh right now. And, I'm talking about it a lot. And so you can see that I'm, it moves me to tears to have, to be talking about it again. And there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about my mother. That doesn't mean I'm unhappy, but I think about her all the time. And I think that what the book taught me, writing it, is that, it's almost like I have two versions of my mother. And one of them is indeed from that poem, as you say, the corpse I carry on my back. I mean, that is the grief. And with that is an unwillingness to ever put it down. I don't want to put her down. But the other part is the memory of my living mother that is planted like a seed in my heart, and it grows every day.
Absolutely. I think, a natural next question comes from our audience here. Elaine McLean Timmel writes, as you mentioned, trauma fragments the self. So does sharing your story, your mother's story, help put the self back together? And do you feel like this helps others?
Well, the putting the self back together began a long time ago with the diary that my mother gave me, where I began to write and to compose myself in the aftermath of that initial trauma of learning that she was being abused. And I do think that, this is one of the reasons that I became a writer, that being able to write, to tell this story, to engage with it, either in poetry or in prose, has definitely composed the self that would have been otherwise divided and eroded by trauma. I'd like to think that other people might see that finding a way to tell their own story offers the possibility of that kind of composing of the self. And in that way, people might be helped toward writing their own narratives.
You're obviously an immensely talented and prolific poet. That's clear. But memoir is, clearly a different medium. So can you talk a bit about the differences between writing the incredible prose of your memoir to writing poetry? Were there similarities, differences? I mean, how was that experience?
Yeah, the similarities are that, both as a prose writer and a poet, I am always drawn to the rhythm and the lyricism of syntax. So even when I'm not making use of lineation as in a poem, I'm still very focused on the rhythm of sentences and how they can sound like poetry. The musicality of that is embedded in even in very lyrical prose. I also found that I tend to even write prose in many of the same ways that I'm writing poetry. I think about the long arc of a whole collection of poems, even as it's made up of individual parts. And I thought about that same kind of um, long arc in this book that makes it feel like an extended prose poem to me. But the differences, I mean, there would be moments that I'd be writing a part of the memoir, and I would have to stop and turn a page over because whatever else was happening started to come out as a poem. So you mentioned the poem Imperatives for Carrying On in the Aftermath. That is a poem that I wrote in the middle of working on a section of Memorial Drive
Wow.
that could only come out as a poem. So yeah, I turned the sheet of paper over and I wrote that poem.
Right.
And there are a few other poems in Monument, in the new portion of Monument, that all came out in the midst of writing this.
Mm. Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. See, we have another question from our audience. And this is something that I wanted to ask as well, but you mentioned dreams several times. So can you talk about the importance of dreams to you and maybe how these dreams influence your writing?
Yes, dreams are made of metaphor. I mean, they're so perfectly metaphorical. In the way that they also often have a bit of a grasp on reality. So, for example, the very first dream, and which is the very first thing that I read today, the dream I had a few weeks after my mother's death. In the dream, we're walking around together on what seems like an oval track. I know she's dead. So there's this kind of literal aspect to it. She's dead. I know she's dead. She has a wound that, not unlike the wound she actually suffered. And yet, everything also about it is metaphorical. I mean, that wound is, in the center of her head. The light is shining through it, bathing me in the light. I think of the poet Rumi, who wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." So, all of the literal aspects of the dream that connected to real life were also being mediated through this figurative lens. And so I always, look at dreams like that and as a teacher of creative writing, I know that they are a rich source to mine to help us make sense of our waking lives and the things that we are trying to work out in the subconscious. Another dream that I write about in the book is, these dreams that I started, once I decided I was going to write about her, I had more dreams about her in the span of a couple of weeks or so that I had in years. And the one that was so powerful to me was this dream of seeing her walking around as an old woman, the woman she never became, touching various objects as if she's contemplating her life through the physical objects she's collected. And then when I wake up, I think, oh, I want to see what they were, because that will tell me something about who she was. But the reality was that in the dream, she never turns around. Her back is to me the whole time. So I don't see the things she touches. Well, that's also a kind of metaphor for what of her I've lost and what I can hold on to. But it also reminded me of a very literal moment in my own life, and that was the morning I learned that she'd been killed. Before I could get myself ready to go with the police officer who had shown up at my college dorm room to take me back to Atlanta, I kind of do that same thing. I walk around straightening things on my shelves as if I could put them in their proper place, the world would be realigned.
Wow. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. One more, I think we have time for one more question from the audience. And this is from Jane Marcellus. And you mentioned Vivian Gornick. Who are some other memoirists whose work you read as you were finding how to tell your story?
I read and reread both of Kim Barnes's memoirs. She's just she's also a poet, and so her lyricism is absolutely gorgeous. I read Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking again and again. Michael Gilmore's Shot in the Heart. Eudora Welty's One Writer's Beginnings. There are just so many. But they all taught me different things. Oh, Lucy Greeley's Autobiography of the Face. Yeah, there are a lot of them.
Thank you. Thank you. I guess we do have 4 minutes. So I have a question about structure. And you started, the book has a non-linear structure. You know, you started with your mother's death, and then you work back, and then you drop into your kind of present or current at moment. So I'm just wondering why you chose to take this non-linear structure.
Well, I think it was important that we begin with your full awareness that she's dead and that she's been murdered. I think by doing that, it's a way of robbing that event of a little of its sensationalism. I'm not telling you, the kind of true crime narrative that's going to culminate in her death. I wanted that as a given up front because I wanted also that the book enact this, enact in the reader, if I could, this overwhelming desire to keep her alive. I wanted readers to read it knowing that she's dead, but hoping at every turn for a different outcome.
Mm-hmm. And we have one more comment from the audience. Natasha Trethewey is such a powerful writer. I enjoyed hearing this conversation so much. This is true. This is true. I really, again, this was a hard read for me, but I certainly enjoyed reading Memorial Drive. I want to thank you, Natasha, for taking time with us today and talking about your life and your work. I want to thank our festival sponsors, again, Metro Nashville Arts Commission, the Ingram Content Group, the Tennessee Arts Commission, Vanderbilt University, and Parnassus Books. Make sure to buy a copy of Memorial Drive if you don't already have it through Parnassus. That would certainly benefit the festival. And I want to thank you all for attending the festival and attending this session with us today. So I will leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you.